Hello, good evening. I'm happy to introduce this last session for today. I'm Nikolas Kosmatopoulos. I'm assistant professor in the American University of Beirut. And this is our second day in our Decolonize Hellas Symposium. And that's also the time for our second keynote speech by distinguished Professor Mahmood Mamdani at Columbia University, who's going to be talking to us about his new book called Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. Professor Mamdani is with us online here. Hello Mahmoud. Hello, Professor. Welcome. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you. That's also good to see that you have now permanent electricity, because last time I saw your talk at Jadaliya, there was a lot of accidents about electricity, but in Lebanon we are used to that. It's good to know that you are probably also in New York.
I'm in New York City, and the electricity supply is steady and regular. I'm just sorry this happened in Kampala because it was very stormy weather, a lot of thunder, lightning.
Good to have you with us today. We are very, very happy to have you on board, and that you accepted our invitation to have this keynote. I'm going to say a few words about your work, which is already doing injustice to your immense work on a variety of themes. Among them, of course, the latest book that we are very much interested today in, Decolonize Hellas, and to talk about it today in this meeting, and also connect to your previous work on colonialism and post-colonialism. So, for those of you who don't know Mahmood Mamdani, he's an Ugandan academic, author, and political commentator. He, as I said, he's a professor of anthropology in the Columbia University, in the Misas department, which I also did my postdoc there, and I was also I met Mahmoud through Tal al-Assad sometimes, but it was actually, unfortunately, I think you were in Kampala this time, so I didn't really get to talk to you a lot. But definitely I know your work very well, and I'm very much inspired by it. So he's also serving as the chancellor of Kampala International University in Uganda. I think you're still in this position, if I'm not wrong. And he's a director of the Makerere Institute of Social Research. And also at Columbia, he serves as the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government in the School of International and Public Affairs. Professor Mamdani has been working for many years, researching and working in the study of African international politics, colonialism and post-colonialism, the politics of knowledge production, and he has produced very influential books on the topic. Some of them are, he started with a book in 1972, The Myth of Population Control, Family, Class and Caste in an Indian Village. From Citizen to Refugee, Ugandan Asians Come to Britain, Politics and Class Formation in Uganda, Imperialism and Fascism in Uganda, Academic Freedom in Africa, Citizen as Subject, a very influential book, Contemporary Africa and the Legacy of Late Colonialism, When Victims Become Killers, Colonialism, Nativism and Genocide in Rwanda, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, America, the Cold War and the Roots of Terror in 2004, Scholars in the Marketplace, The Dilemmas of Neoliberal Reform at Makerere University, Saviors and Survivors, Darfur, Politics and the War on Terror, also a very influential book, Define and Rule, Native as a Political Identity, that was an influential book, at least for me and my work, When Victims Become Killers, Colonialism, Nativism and the Genocide in Rwanda, and finally, last but not least, Neither Settler Nor Native. I think what's interesting about this book is that speaks directly to our discussions today about the role of colonialism in forming the nation state. And in that sense, it's a very central argument. At least I think the genealogical part of the argument is very, very relevant to us, because Decolonize Hellas is actually looking back in the history of the formation of the Greek nation state. And we want to introduce a discussion that is really non-existent in Greece, the discussion about colonialism and the influence of colonialism in the formation of the Greek nation state. This is a relatively new iteration of this discussion. There are many previous efforts to bring this discussion in different ways to Greece. But as far as I know, this is the first systematic effort to bring several topics to shine upon the Greek nation state. Just before, we had a very interesting panel, for example, on Roma in Greece and their position in the Greek nation state. There are also very relevant discussions that touch upon contemporary issues. There was a police killing practically of a Roma person 2 weeks ago. There's a big discussion around this. There's a big discussion about minorities in a state that doesn't recognize actually officially minorities. So I think your latest book can be very helpful to us to rethink the making and unmaking of modern minorities. I'll say only 2 words about the book, actually from the blurb, and then I'll give you the floor. The book makes the radical argument that the nation state was born of colonialism. It calls us to rethink political violence and reimagine political community beyond majorities and minorities. In this genealogy of political modernity, Professor Mamdani argues that the nation state and the colonial state created each other in case after case around the globe, from the New World to South Africa, Israel, Palestine, to Germany, to Sudan. The colonial state and the nation state have been mutually constructed through the politicization of the religious or ethnic majority at the expense of an equally manufactured minority. I think this is actually already clear how relevant this might be to Greece. Your book doesn't touch on Greece, but I think this is our job, perhaps, to bring it to Greece, and this is what we try to do now. The model emerged in North America, where genocide and internment on reservations created both a permanent native underclass and the physical and ideological spaces in which new immigrant identities crystallized as a settler nation. In Europe, this template would be used by the Nazis to address the Jewish question, and after the fall of the Third Reich, by the Allies to redraw the boundaries of Eastern Europe's nation-states, cleansing them of the minorities. After Nuremberg, the template was used to preserve the idea of the Jews as a separate nation. By establishing Israel through the minorization of Palestinian Arabs, Zionist settlers followed the North American example. The result has been another cycle of violence. So welcome to Athens via New York. We are really excited to hear your talk today.
Thank you very much, Nikolas. I thank Professor Nikolas Kosmatopoulos and the organizers of this conference for inviting me to give this talk. I wish I could have visited Athens, but that's not possible in this seemingly never-ending pandemic. But this is the second best, to be able to talk to you on Zoom. So as Nikolas said, this is my opportunity to provide you an overview of my new book, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. Neither Settler Nor Native is about the nation state and post-colonial modernity. The introduction opens with a history of the 2 phases of the nation state, non-liberal and liberal. I argue that the nation state was born in Iberia in 1492. Its agenda was summed up by a single slogan: one country, one people, one religion. This project set fire to relations between majority and minorities within the boundaries of the state. setting in motion processes of ethnic cleansing, especially of Jews and Muslims. This was followed by a century of religious wars in Europe. I identify this as the first, the non-liberal phase in the making of the nation state. The liberal solution to religious wars was the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Two key components of the modern state were born at Westphalia: religious toleration at home and the reciprocal guarantee of sovereignty abroad. It is John Locke, the English philosopher, who theorized the liberal solution in his treatise on tolerance, published in 1689. Catholics can be tolerated if they renounce any political support of the Pope or any power or of any power outside England. This is how Locke formulated the key tenet of the liberal theory of the nation state. The liberal notion of the nation state turned majority and minority into permanent political identities. Only the majority has sovereignty. The minority must not participate in sovereignty. The notion of a sovereign majority alongside non-sovereign minorities was the original sin of liberal political theory. In Neither Settler Nor Native, I explore the export of the notion of different kinds of citizens, sovereign and non-sovereign, from the US to South Africa and Nazi Germany, and finally to Israel. At the same time, the book explores the construction of an epistemological project that grounded the political distinction between sovereign and non-sovereign subjects in a legal distinction. Beginning with religious groups, this distinction was extended to a civilizational difference between races and tribes. I explore this development in some detail in the chapter on Sudan. Neither Settler Nor Native is a book about the United States as a founding experience in modern colonialism. The first chapter explores the Indian reservation as the site where core institutions of modern colonialism were forged. It's a book about extreme violence as a consequence of modern nation-state building in the post-colonies. Should we think of extreme violence as the consequence of a criminal project executed by individuals, no matter how numerous, along lines of the criminal model popularized by Nuremberg and today upheld by the ICC? Or should we think of it as a political project, a notion born of the transition from apartheid in South Africa? What can we learn from the failure of denazification and the relative success of post-apartheid South Africa? Finally, the book asks, what is transportable in the South African experience? What does South Africa have to teach us? To answer this question, the last chapter takes a fresh look. A look through South African lenses at Israel-Palestine, likely the most intractable political problem in today's world. In this talk, I'd like to comment on 4 issues. First, by taking the US as a case, I will compare the colonial conquest of Indians and the racial domination of Africans to distinguish between colonial conquest and racial domination as 2 different ways of subjugation, each with a radically different consequence. Second, I ask, what is the difference between an immigrant and a settler? Third, I suggest we think of 2 different ways of thinking of political identity, as political and changing as opposed to natural and unchanging. To historicize identity is to see it as born of a particular form of the state, and therefore as changeable. But to see it as the ground for a natural and permanent claim is to think of identity as a timeless expression of a trans-historical and innate cultural self. Finally, I suggest that we decouple the nation and the state as we seek an alternative to the nation state. I shall begin with American Indians and African Americans. How should we call the pre-Columbian resident communities of the Americas? as Indian or as native? What's in a name? Indian is the name Columbus gave peoples of the New World. Today, we consider native a more politically correct designation. Yet neither the US government nor the peoples they colonized accept it. The museum in Washington, D.C., dedicated to pre-Columbian civilization in the Americas, is called the Museum of the American Indian. What difference would it make if it were called the Museum of the Native American? Why is it that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians in reservations, so that a separate Indian Civil Rights Act had to be passed in 1968? To be sure, the two acts are not the same. The 1964 Act is constitutionally binding, whereas the 1968 Indian Act is not. It is only advisory. Reservation Indians are not and never have been rights-bearing citizens of the US in a constitutional sense. There were no reservations before the United States. The reservation was a creation of the US. Though the reservation is geographically within the territory of the US, it's a polity separate from the US. The Europeans who came to America were not immigrants, they were settlers. What is the difference? Whether they seek equality or advantage, immigrants come to join existing polities. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. Indian reservations are not part of the sovereign state we call the US. The term Indian tribal sovereignty, another politically correct phrase, masks this reality of colonial domination. Legally, the reservation Indians are wards of Congress. Reservation authorities are overseen by a vast federal bureaucracy known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The BIA is no different from the colonial bureaucracy that governed any indirect rule colony in Africa. The Indian reservation was part of a two-state solution. The two-state solution, a sovereign state alongside a non-sovereign protectorate, was Lincoln's contribution in the second half of the 19th century. It claimed to provide a permanent solution for Indians who had survived the genocide. Germany also embraced a two-state solution after Nuremberg. Instead of reintegrating Jews as equal citizens in a single state, as part of a one-state solution, post-Holocaust Germany embraced the idea of a separate state for Jews. As a result, even if the Nazi project was defeated militarily, it survived politically. The two-state solution gave the Nazi project a longer political lease. The latest version of the two-state solution is in Israel-Palestine. In contrast to South Africa, where the population was subordinated, majority of the population in Israel was expelled outside its boundaries, as it had been in the US when Indians were herded into reservations. America also originated the notion of differentiated citizenship, with only some participating in sovereignty. Until 1921, Indians were nationals, but not citizens. After that, Indians had first to be purged as members of Indian polities before they could be naturalized as US citizens. Colonized Indians and African slaves represent two different colonial solutions. Both were turned into minorities, one inside the state, the other outside it. One was sustained by colonial conquest, the other by racial domination. The consequences have been radically different. Racial and colonial domination are not the same. Even if racial discrimination is common to both, reservation Indians have a different relationship to the US from that of African Americans. Colonization refers to conquest of territory. The American Indian symbolized land which has been stolen. The African slave embodied captive and coerced labor. The one-state solution provided a political frame for the development of the struggle against Jim Crow and racial domination. Even if it proceeded by fits and starts, even receding at times. The one-state framework both underlined the necessity of developing alliances and made it possible. The two-state solution explains both the continued isolation of the reservation Indian through colonization and their ongoing fragmentation as a people. The radical difference in the political effect of each solution is clear from the American case. The one-state solution has provided a political context for alliance building in a general emancipatory struggle. In contrast, a two-state solution has imposed isolation on an oppressed group by imposing on it a separate political home, a protectorate, and compounded that isolation with ongoing fragmentation in multiple reservations. I conclude that a one-state solution is politically preferable to a two-state solution. The American model was exported to a number of places, among these South Africa, Germany, and Israel. South African settlers attained state independence in 1910. A delegation visited North America, USA, and Canada 2 years later to study how Indians were governed. Three key elements of governance were imported to South Africa: homeland, traditional authority, and customary law. The starting fiction was that every tribe has from time immemorial lived in a territorially contained homeland. The fiction of a homeland in reality masked a program to expel each tribe from the bulk of its historical lands. Second, every homeland was said to have been administered by traditional authority, also said to be from time immemorial, eternally sanctioned by custom. This authority was said to be customary, not elected. Third, this traditional authority claimed the right to enforce a customary law on the homeland. Custom, too, was said to have been there from time immemorial. This time, though, settlers insisted that custom be excised of all practices or notions that settlers considered repugnant to civilization. I will return to discussing the lessons of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa after a discussion of Germany and Israel. South Africa was not the only one that learned from the US. So did Nazi Germany and Hitler. Hitler drew two lessons from the US. The first was that genocide is doable and therefore thinkable. The second was that it's possible to create a second and a third-class citizenship, as of African Americans, Indian citizens after 1921, later Puerto Ricans in the US. Hitler appointed a committee of lawyers to study American citizenship laws. This was background preparation for the drafting of Nuremberg laws. The learning process has been documented by James Q. Whitman of Yale University in his book, Hitler's American Model. I argued that post-war denazification failed because the Allies shut their eyes to the political project that inspired and propelled Nazism. Nazism was a striving for a purified nation state, one that would go beyond distinguishing the national majority from national minorities to purifying the nation by expunging all minorities. After the Second World War, there was an American debate on Nazism. Was Germany liberated or occupied? Was Nazism a state project or a social project? Who should be held responsible for Nazism? The nation or the state? Nazi leaders or the German people? The American consensus was that the responsibility for Nazism lay with the German people. At Nuremberg and after, millions were considered criminally culpable, though each one individually. Yet Nazism was never probed as a political project. A similar debate unfolded inside Germany, particularly among German left intellectuals, the most prominent being Franz Neumann and Herbert Marcuse. Neumann wrote Behemoth, a book that dissected National Socialism. His answer, Nazism was neither just a state project nor just a project of German society. Nazism was rather a nation-state project, a project of both the Nazi state and the nation, the folk, to eradicate the presence of national minorities, Jews, Roma, and others, from state territory. From this point of view, Nazism was above all a political project. Denazification would thus require an alliance of all anti-Nazi forces, external and internal. The allies, and those sections of Nazi society that had resisted Nazism. But Americans were unwilling to do so. Only the Soviets were willing in the East, but only temporarily, and not after the Berlin Uprising. I argued that Nuremberg failed to root out Nazism politically. To understand why, I distinguish the criminal model, which understands violence as the result of antisocial acts of individual perpetrators, from the political model, which sees extreme violence as the result of group mobilization around a collective nation-state project. Rather than individualize the violence as a standalone act, I point to cycles of violence sustained by groups mobilized as so many constituencies. Rather than catalog atrocities so as to name, shame, and punish individual perpetrators, I seek to identify issues around which constituencies were mobilized. More importantly, rather than exclude perpetrators from the political process, I seek to include them along with all those who survived, victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, bystanders. I use the term survivor differently from how it was used after the Holocaust or after the Rwandan genocide, not just to refer to surviving victims of extreme violence, but to all who survived the catastrophe we know as extreme violence. The point is to try and stop the cycle of violence by shifting attention from perpetrators to the issues that drive the violence. I will skip the section on Sudan because I don't want to make this too long. And I will go on to Israel and the US. Are Jewish people in Israel settlers or immigrants? The Jewish population of Mandate Palestine belonged to three groups. First were those who had never left. They were among the natives of Palestine. Second were those who returned to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage, seeking a religious homeland. They were content to be part of the existing polity. This group were known as the first Aliyah. They were immigrants. Then followed those in the second and the third Aliyahs. They looked to create their own exclusive polity, a Jewish nation state in place of the existing polity. These are the settlers. The Zionists drew a lesson from Germany. Victims of the nation state project in Germany and in Europe, Zionists decided to set up a nation state in Eretz Israel. The Zionist state project unfolded in two phases. The first reduced Palestinians from a majority to a minority. This catastrophic expulsion is known as the Nakba. The Zionist project has continued to demonize the minority that remained within its territorial boundaries as a demographic threat whose numbers must be cut down. In other words, the Nakba continues. Palestinians inside Israel do not participate in sovereignty. They have rights, even political rights, including the right to vote, but they do not participate in power. This vision has become clearer as the state project has been redefined, from Israel as a Jewish and democratic state to Israel as a Jewish state. In this context, Palestinians face two options: a one-state solution where they would face racial exclusion, including political marginalization, but within the same state. In contrast, the two-state solution would create a protectorate and lead to indirect colonialism under Zionist rule. Neither settler nor native argues that a one-state solution will provide a better framework for building alliances for a durable resistance. Second, I argue that resistance is not enough. One also needs the vision of a different future. I propose that we look at the South African transition from apartheid for a glimpse of a third alternative. Let's look at South Africa, a third alternative. A different vision emerged in South Africa in the 1970s. Before the 70s, anti-apartheid politics was largely derivative. By uncritically embracing the architecture of apartheid, the resistance reproduced it. Each racial group organized separately, as defined by apartheid power. Africans organized as ANC, African National Congress, Indians as Indian Congress of Natal, coloreds as Colored People's Congress, and whites as Congress of Democrats. Apartheid's ideological hold was not broken until the 1970s. The key initiative came from the student movement, white and black. The starting point was after black students under Biko left the liberal white student organization, formed their own separate body, and went on to organize township dwellers, starting with Soweto. Radical white students left in the wilderness turned to organizing hostile workers on the fringes of these same townships. The turning point in anti-apartheid politics was not the armed struggle, but the strikes that began in Durban in 1973 and the uprising in Soweto in 1976. The Soweto uprising unfolded under the banner of Black consciousness. Biko said, "Black is not a color. If you're oppressed, you are Black." The important thing is to recognize that there was nothing inevitable about the impact of BC, Black consciousness, on the anti-apartheid struggle. BC could have led to a nation-state consciousness, claiming that South Africa is a Black nation of the Black majority, thus essentializing Black as a trans-historical identity. Instead, it led to an epistemological awakening, the consciousness of Black as a historical political identity. Afrikaners made a journey from being junior partners of British colonialism to being part of the anti-apartheid coalition. Even here, there was no consensus. The rift inside the Afrikaner community was demonstrated by the publication of a book authored by Rian Malan, the great-grandson of a Boer state president. The book was called My Traitor's Heart. Malan was a crime reporter for the Johannesburg Star. His beat covered Black townships. Each chapter of his book focused on a specific type of what was then called Black-on-Black violence. One chapter was devoted to the Hammerman, a big Black man who wielded a heavy hammer to smash the skull of his victims, all equally Black, but poor people who would yield small pittances. Malan's subtext was not difficult to decipher. If they can do this to their own people, what will they do to us if given half a chance? The South African Moment was born in the 70s and 80s. This birth was marked by a threefold shift in vision. From opposition to apartheid, they looked for an alternative to apartheid. Rather than being content with turning the world upside down, they dared to think of a different world. From a state of the majority, the national majority, the Black majority, the resistance began looking to create a state of all the people. From opposition to whites, the resistance went on to oppose white power. I suggest we think of 1994 as marking the birth of a new political community. The alternative would have been to rupture the existing community into two separate ones, as in Sudan, one for victims, the other for perpetrators, one for Blacks, the other for whites, requiring a partition of South Africa as of Sudan. Let us not forget that in 1994, Afrikaners were divided about the future, with a minority asking for a homeland where Afrikaners would have their own state. The anti-apartheid movement chose a different future. a common future for survivors, but all who survived, whether victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, or bystanders. The principal critique of 1994 is that there was no social justice. This critique both states a truism and misses the significance of the political rebirth. That was 1994. I argue that we should see the rebirth as the beginning of political decolonization. The turning point was the reformulation of the central demand from black majority rule to non-racial rule. Rather than deny the existence of race as phenotypical difference, they refused to endow racial difference with a political significance. The first step to decolonizing the political was deracialization. The next step would be detribalization. Rather than deny the cultural significance of tribe as an ethnic group, detribalization would decouple the link forged under colonialism between culture and territory, ethnicity and homeland. To do so would reverse the process whereby colonialism and apartheid politicize culture through the creation of homelands, where a homeland authority would enforce a customary law. The result would be a single citizenship, not multiple citizenships based on separate identifications, race in the central state and tribe in the homelands. 1994 created formal political equality in South Africa, regardless of race, but it has yet to create formal political equality in the former homelands, regardless of ethnic identity. My claim is that a successful struggle for social justice will need to cut across the political divide imposed by race and tribe. Without political equality, the mobilization for social justice will be fragmented into so many races and tribes. It will more likely lead to an internal civil war. The result will stink, like the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, or its mini version, the ongoing xenophobic violence in South Africa. Excuse me. At the core of political Zionism is a political project to build not just a Jewish religious community in the Holy Land, but a Jewish state. Political Zionism seeks to erase the distinction between state and society. The conflation of state with society is the foundation of the nation state and its program of rule by a permanent national majority. The nation state may call itself a democracy, as Israel does, but this majority is not actually determined through political contestation. Rather, the majority is defined pre-politically, as in the nation. The most the majority can hope for is a democracy for the majority, but not for all. But even majoritarian democracy remains a difficult project in Israel because the state defines who can be a member of that majority. In other words, the state defines who is officially recognized as a Jew. If Israel is to be a state for Jews only, it must answer the question, who is a Jew? Its answer cannot avoid flattening the diversity of world Jewry into the Jewry sanctioned by the state. At the legal level, this question has bedeviled Israeli authorities since the law of return was passed in 1950. Is a Jew defined by religion or by ethnicity, or both? The state of Israel now has two legal definitions of who is a Jew. The narrow definition provided by religious law, halacha law, which Israel enforces in the sphere of personal affairs, and the broad definition in the amended law of return. At the political and social level, Judaization eliminates an unacceptable forms of Jewishness. The acceptable form is associated with Ashkenazim, European Jews who trace their lineage to Yiddish-speaking parts of Europe. Ashkenazim were the founders of the state, who claimed to be civilizers committed to bringing other Jews into line with the national ideal. In particular, Ashkenazim have sought to civilize Mizrahim. The Mizrahim are Arab Jews. They present a special challenge to Zionism. For Zionism presumes that Arab and Jewish identity are both incompatible and indelibly hostile toward one another. Otherwise, there would be no need of a Jewish state in historic Palestine. Ashkenazi Israel has demanded of the Mizrahim that they denounce their Arab culture and embrace only their religion, Judaism. After several decades, the Mizrahim have paid back by standing behind a stark religious Zionism that has two targets, the Ashkenazim and the Palestinians. In the Zionist worldview, Palestinians are Canaanites who never left home. They are squatters, not natives. The Zionist demand is that after the Holocaust, the squatter must make room for the returning native and get out of the way. The development of a Palestinian consciousness straddling these three groups has been an outcome of a protracted process whose focus and center of gravity have shifted radically over time. From exile to home and from an all-out or nothing demand for Israel's disintegration to a demand for involvement in the Israeli political process. Organizationally, this has involved a threefold transition. At first, displaced Palestinians looked to Arab frontline states to be their protectors and liberators. After these Arab states were defeated in 1967, Palestinians turned to the nascent and exile-led PLO, an armed resistance movement. In 1982, Israel went to war in Lebanon. The brainchild of Ariel Sharon, then the defense minister, this was a total war against Palestinians. The IDF deployed well over 120,000 troops for over 10 weeks. It was the country's largest mobilization since the 1973 war, according to Rashid Khalidi, the leading Palestinian historian. Outgunned and overwhelmed, the PLO withdrew to Tunis. Even if the PLO was defeated, Sharon's strategic objective remained unrealized. Instead, the war intended to suppress Palestinian nationalism only stoked it further. With the exiled armed resistance smashed, the moment was ripe for political mobilization at home. The first Intifada in the late 1980s crystallized the internalization of Palestinian leadership, and with it, a definitive rejection of the failed armed resistance championed by the external leadership with a mainly refugee base. The second Intifada, beginning in 2000, brought together Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories under a single movement. Both Intifadas responded to the failings of the official Palestinian liberation movement. The second Intifada in particular reflected frustration over the PLO's capitulation to Zionism at the Oslo Accords of 1993 and the onward rush of settlements that followed it. Arafat made two crucial compromises at Oslo. First, he tacitly accepted settlements in the West Bank. Second, he explicitly accepted Israel's stranglehold over the economy and sovereignty of the occupied territories, even going so far as to agree that this stranglehold would persist in a future Palestinian state. The success of the Second Intifada led to mobilization under Balad, a political party led at the time by Azmi Bishara, a Palestinian member of the Knesset. Bishara and Balad's contribution can be summed up in two bills he introduced in the Knesset over the years. The first was a new basic law calling for collective rights and complete civic equality, but not political equality of the minority and the majority. This first bill was still within the framework of a nation-state politics, accepting the distinction between the majority nation and its minorities. The second bill went a step further. It asked the Knesset to affirm that Israel is a state of all its citizens, whereas Bishara's first bill sought equal rights for the national minority. Now he was asking the Knesset explicitly to reject the idea that Israel is a nation state, a state of the Jewish people, thereby negating the existence of both the national minority and the national majority. Over the past decade, Palestinian politics has moved from an engagement predominantly internal to one predominantly external. The internal engagement called for a state of all its citizens as a counter to the Zionist project for a Jewish state. The external engagement takes the form of an international boycott of Israeli state and society under BDS. Boycott, divestment, sanctions. To the extent that BDS calls for the de-Zionization of the state of Israel, there is reason to give it full and enthusiastic support. But to the extent that BDS seeks to extend this boycott to Israeli society, and not just to its Zionist sectors, there is reason for caution. BDS needs to learn from the very experience it claims to build on. That is the South African divestment and boycott during apartheid. As a participant in the anti-apartheid boycott, I came to realize that its key mistake was to collapse state, regime, and society into a seamless whole. The main problem with blanket boycotts is that they embrace a mirror image of the nation-state framework, which collapses state and society into one. By themselves, international boycotts are incomplete. The strategy of isolating the state internationally needs to be aligned with a domestic strategy to isolate the forces that stand behind the state project internally, to drive a wedge between pro-state forces in civil society and those not aligned to the state. For Palestinians and Israelis, both those anti-Zionist and non-Zionist, the South African struggle offers two lessons. In Israel, as in South Africa, this means overcoming two categories of divisions. The first is the division among victims of the nation state. In South Africa, the population was divided among township dwellers and Bantustan residents, a barrier overcome by a coalition of students and workers. The victimized population was also divided racially and tribally. The racial barrier was overcome by the Black consciousness movement, while the tribal barrier remains. Among the Palestinians, there's a tripartite division of victims, those living in the diaspora, the occupied territories, and Israel proper. Each of these groups has been further differentiated. The diaspora includes those in the refugee camps and those beyond. Residents of the occupied territories are split between the West Bank and Gaza, and oppressed citizens of Israel include Arabs, Druze, and Bedouin. Each microgroup is subject to a different political regime, designed to produce a specific and separate subjectivity. The second phase in South Africa led to winning over a sizable number of apartheid supporters to the anti-apartheid cause. That may be harder in Israel. That said, we cannot forget that the ground shifted from under the apartheid state when Afrikaners, who provided most of the foot soldiers for apartheid's machinery of repression, opened up to an alternative to the apartheid order. The Afrikaner shift from the right of the political spectrum to its middle range shows that no political identity is permanent. What can BDS learn from the South African experience? First, whereas the BDS can contribute to Israel's international isolation, something else is needed if a non-Zionist alternative is to bloom in Israel itself. Like in South Africa, that something else is an epistemic revolution that will open the way to a political one. The Palestinian moment will come when the resistance recognizes the complementarity of two seemingly different objectives: to unify the oppressed and to fragment their opposition so as to isolate the core opponents. The goal should be to arrive at a point whereby it is not just the oppressed who seek political change, but also many of the current supporters of Zionist power. Getting there will require a new kind of political consciousness within Israel, a consciousness based on a double recognition that there can be no military solution to the Palestine-Israel question, and that the flourishing of Jews and Jewish life does not require a Zionist state. Apartheid fell because of the confluence of two developments. The better known of these is the anti-apartheid uprising in the townships. The uprising brought diverse groups under a single umbrella. The result was not a victory, but a deadlock. Why then did the National Party choose to go to the negotiating table, to shift focus from a military to a political struggle? Because the NP realized that it was beginning to lose the support of important sections of the Boer intelligentsia, which were calling for a political solution to the problem of apartheid. The writing was on the wall. More and more of this intelligentsia were convinced, excuse me, that whites did not need to monopolize political power to have a home in South Africa. It is this lesson that needs to be driven home to Israelis, as many as possible. That Jews do not need to have a Jewish state to have a secure home in Israel-Palestine. Indeed, Jews are more secure in New York City than they are in Israel. The lesson for BDS is that they need to build on the gains made by Balad. To do so would be to provide a political home to anti-Zionist and even non-Zionist Jews in Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. It started off with the US and then moved closer to our neighborhood. I think it was full of very useful and important insights that we can definitely discuss. I would like to open the discussion now here. There are some people watching us online, but there are also some brave ones here in the room. We have a few minutes actually to discuss, and it would be great if we can take the opportunity to do so. So is there any question from the audience? Would you like to ask? If you don't, I will. So if I may, since I don't see anything so far, Mahmoud, there are so many things I would like to ask, but mostly I would like to ask you to interrogate, if you wish, the basis of the comparison that you're presenting here. There's a comparison, and comparisons, as we know, are risky. You compare South Africa with Israel and Sudan, which I think it's safe to do so through the frame of the nation state and the majority rule, so to say, continuing your previous work on politicizing culture, as you very nicely put it, and as we know. My question is mostly about Israel-Palestine and this region here. How is it the comparison maybe different when we talk about a place that has already seen state structures before the rise of this exclusionary nation state? I mean, in contrast to the United States, in Israel-Palestine, we had, the Ottoman legacy of a different approach to majority-minority rule, and how that genealogy, how this legacy, if you wish, might have interrogated differently, the discussion around the formation of majority-minority rule in Israel-Palestine. And that I'm asking you that because, here in Decolonize Hellas, we are touching upon this post-Ottoman space. We're talking about how, Greece, Hellas, as the first modern state that came out of this region, very much, adopted the politicization of culture. We learned today, something that we already knew, but we learned again, that the first identity was based on religion. The first Greek citizen was a Christian subject, and that very much politicization of culture traveled to other places in the region, like in Lebanon in 1860, and further. Maybe also Israel-Palestine as the latest version of it, of course, with the implication of the European colonial project and the European movement of Zionism. But my question is, how did this background of a totally different, state structure, if you will, the Ottoman state, makes also the comparison a bit less comparable or less stable, if it does.
Thank you very much. So that's a great question and a very productive question for me. So in this particular book, I trace a single genealogy, okay, from the US, South Africa, Nazi Germany, Israel, Palestine. But that doesn't mean that the institutional framework, the state framework in the present has a single origin. In my previous book, Citizen and Subject, I actually presumed a single origin, which I kind of elaborated in Define and Rule. And I then thought that the single origin was really sort of late 19th century, following the mid-19th century crises of imperialism, particularly of British imperialism, the defeat of British, the massive crises of British imperial rule in India, 1857 uprising, in West Indies, Walvis Bay in the 1860s, and the Mahdiya in Sudan, the 1890s. And it undermined the liberal Enlightenment civilizing mission. The liberal mission was coded in sort of two projects. One was the export of rule of law. And the second project was the export of the modern university. The main critique was Sir Henry Maine, who argued that the 1857 uprising was the result of an epistemic defect. And the epistemic defect, he argued, was that the British had presumed India to be a blank slate. They had not bothered to understand the historicity of the Indian people, and particularly how India kept itself together. And Henry Maine came up with the notion of custom, that it is not the state which kept order, but it was society which kept order through custom. And the British project from 1857 onwards was to harness custom from society, take custom from society and harness it to the state as state law. Now you can say another trajectory. I then discovered, of course, as I read the American example in the creation of reservations in the US. But now you come up with the Ottoman. An Ottoman is not, it's different, but it's not very different. The Ottomans created the millet system. The Ottomans ruled colonized people, subject peoples, through their own institution and their own leadership. Right. So far as I know, the leadership in each millet was the leadership of the millet. It was not imposed on it. The British went a step further with indirect rule. They not only decided who was the genuine leadership, but they didn't just take custom from society and instrumentalize it for the state, but they also reformed custom. They also decided that custom was unitary. There could not be different versions of custom, unlike in England, where common law assumes different versions or allows for it. So we have at least 3 trajectories, 3 different genealogies which intersect. They certainly intersect in Palestine. The intersection between civil law and religious custom as personal law. So, I mean, I'm not sure I can say much more, but if there's something you think I can address, please feel free to ask me.
No, that's quite substantial, I think. I don't know if there is any more questions. The thing is that we are quite beyond our time here, and it's difficult to animate more because we spend a lot of attention to your talk. And after a very long day here in Athens, I think the spirits are kind of low. I'm going to ask if there is anybody who wants to ask another question. Otherwise, I'm going to thank you for your talk and for your presence here today. We're very honored to have you, even from far away. Hopefully one day we're going to be able to host you in Athens, and then we're going to ask you more pressingly about the Ottoman past and the place of Greece and Hellas in your genealogies that we might want to think first before asking you further. But definitely I think your talk was very fruitful and very inspirational for us for our work here that we just started practically. So I really want to ask everybody to thank Professor Mamdani today with a clap. And thank you all for being here. Thanks to the technicians for their patience and help. They overstepped also their time. And we're going to continue tomorrow with another marathon of events. So you're very welcome to join if you haven't already felt sick of us. But I hope not. See you tomorrow. Have a good night. Καληνύχτα.